Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this event on decoding the Biden administration, opportunities for the EU. I'm delighted to be here with you. We have two fantastic speakers with us. Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook, who is the Executive Director of the project Europe and the Transatlantic Relationship at the Harvard Kennedy School. And of course, our very own Pierre Vimont, who is a scholar with Carnegie Europe. And we'll be discussing the transatlantic relationship a few days in from the beginning of the Biden administration. And we'd like to look at how the big global challenges look like from both sides of the Atlantic. But before we start, let me just say a couple of things, because the opportunity to organize this discussion comes in conjunction with the publication of a compendium which has involved many of our own Carnegie scholars looking at the transatlantic relationship from a very European perspective and asking the question, what is it that Europe, which has always been a junior partner in the transatlantic relationship, what is it that Europe can offer to the US? How can it put forward a positive and proactive agenda? So this is the compendium. You will find it looks at several policy areas, and you can find it on Carnegie Europe's website. But today we're going to try and look at this topic, this issue, with viewpoints from both sides of the Atlantic. And I'm going to start with Cathryn, because Cathryn has been working on the transatlantic relationship, but is also, of course, based in the United States. So is not just a keen observer of what happens between Europe and the US, but also what happens in the US. So the Biden administration has been using, and during the campaign, of course, has been using the slogan "Build Back Better." And of course, it's been under our eyes, the troubles that US democracy has had. This has caused some distrust also in Europe about the commitments towards working with allies and rebuilding the transatlantic relationship. So what can the US build back better? I think this is a key question. And what are the implications of working with Europe?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I wish we were together in Brussels, where I spent many happy years of my professional life, right around the corner from Carnegie Europe. And I want to compliment you on your compendium. I know we're all putting a lot of thought into this. We issued our own report. Rosa, you were a part of that conversation. So I'm glad we're here to share these ideas, because I think nothing is more critical at this moment than this kind of dialogue and exchange. And that's part of restoring the trust, and part of building back better is these kind of conversations. And of course, I'm happy to see our old friend and partner, Pierre Vimont, on this call as well. Look, I think the Biden administration faces 4 immediate challenges, 2 of which have really an international dimension. And so, I mean, the obvious is, of course, trying to restore the American economy, which has been drawn down terribly, and in that sense, much more affected, and possibly by what might be, or what might end up being, a longer term recession than anything that we saw in 2008. We can talk about the steps that this administration is already taking to make sure the mistakes of 2008 are not repeated. So it's the economic crisis, but I mean, fundamentally, first and foremost, it's getting a handle on the virus. I mean, we surpassed handily in the United States 400,000 deaths a week and a half ago already, and there seems no sign of abating. And so, but those are 2 dimensions that cannot be resolved unless you are cooperating internationally. And I think the actions that we saw immediately in the signature of the executive orders, I mean, on the day the president took office, with respect to rejoining the World Health Organization, trying to participate more actively in international coordination, particularly around vaccine delivery, all those things have an international dimension. The other 2 issues I think that are top of mind for this presidency as part of building back better quickly are the critical elements of restoring faith in American democracy and holding the country together. And so those 2 points would be quelling the differences in sort of racial unrest and tension in the country, restoring what we might think about as equity or building equality truly, which is a longer term challenge, and then combating the polarization. But we saw very clearly over the last couple of days, certainly in the testimony of Tony Blinken, who has just been confirmed as the U.S. Secretary of State, that the fundamental cornerstones, particularly of dealing with the international dimensions of Part 1 and 2, will be to restore the relationship with allies. So building back better, in my mind, doesn't only refer to rebuilding or regaining status quo ante, because we all know we can't go back there, nor should we, because I think Europe has actually come out of this crisis stronger, a more willing and able and more eye-level partner with the United States. And this administration is particularly keen and smart on the fact that Europe has done a lot of the water carrying, restoring and basically holding together the multilateral architecture from the WHO, which we already discussed, the WTO, the Iran nuclear deal, a lot of the elements that underwrite how we can continue to function together. So I think you're going to see from this administration, in part because it's full of Europeanists, that are very multilingual and have long-serving careers that link them to Europe, especially Western Europe, a rededication, but also a great sense of humility in meeting Europe. And I think that's critical if we think that, and know now, that our voters, 6 out of 10 European voters, think that perhaps this administration shouldn't be fully trusted. So there's much work to do. But I do think we now have the right personnel in place in this administration, transatlanticists to the core, and people who know both the tactical, quick decisions that need to be made and the longer-term strategic vision to undergird a relationship that will ultimately help save and progress American domestic issues that are painful and hard to manage.
Thank you, Cathryn. Thank you especially for linking the domestic dimension to the international dimension. I think rarely in history have these two dimensions been so closely interconnected. Pierre, I'd like to ask you the same question. The EU also has been using the slogan Build Back Better. It's in light of the sort of coronavirus package that the EU institutions put together during the summer. But let's not forget that, even if the events in Capitol Hill have been so vivid and shocking in Europe, let's not forget that Europe also has its problems with democracy. OECD forecasts a longer recession than that in the US. We've just signed a divorce agreement with the UK, so there's been a process of fragmentation. And all this pandemic happens after 10 years of perpetual crisis in Europe. So can Europe build back better? And what are the implications for the transatlantic relationship?
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right, Rosa, and thank you for inviting me. Listening to what Cathryn was just saying, I was thinking the 4-point agenda that she just listed is more or less exactly the same priorities that European Union is having on its side, be it the fight against the pandemic, the economic recovery, and the transatlantic partnership and other issues. It seems to me that we're exactly on the same boat to a very large extent. And what is interesting, of course, is that on the European side, there has been this big sigh of relief with the idea that the American partner is back to a more professional and normal way of dealing with its European and transatlantic partners. And I think that is an added value that is really important to keep in mind. On the first point you made, Rosa, the whole issue about how our democracies, Western democracy, liberal democracies, are living up to the challenges they're facing, you're definitely right. Europe is facing exactly the same kind of challenge. If I only look at the most recent elections taking place in Portugal, the presidential election on last Sunday, the rise of the far right. My Portuguese friends used to tell me Portugal is immune from any far right temptation because we have been through our revolution a long time ago, and we managed to get rid of this forever. No, it's not the case. Right-wing extremist political parties are there everywhere, and we have to live up to that challenge more than ever. All the more so, as I think, seen from the outside world, the non-West world, this kind of democratic model, Western model that we have been trying to promote all over the world is really under a strong challenge now with what has happened in the US or what's happening in Europe, in many of our countries. And we have to understand that. For many of our Asian partners, African partners, Latin American partners, the way they are perceiving either the American model or the European model has changed. The way we're struggling with the virus, and we seem to have great difficulty in overcoming this. The way we're struggling with some of our European member states, which are moving further away from the rule of law, and so on and so forth. All this explains that, to some extent, we have a lot of work to do there, and this is definitely a major challenge. I think the other issue, coming back strictly to the US-EU partnership, has to do a lot also about how the Europeans want to move along today with the United States and with the new Biden administration. Looking at some of the most recent polls, the ECFR piece that we've just seen, there seems to me to be, as always, among Europeans, strong division, at least among three groups. Those who believe in a sort of irreversible US decline and therefore are looking for a sort of Europe, fortress Europe, Europe first, far away from any kind of partnership with the outside world. There are those who are hoping to go back to the future, to the good old days of the Transatlantic partnership with the American leadership in full sight and in full speed. And then there are those who are trying to build something new, a sort of more balanced relationship between the European Union and America, with maybe a completely new vision about how we should move together on many of the issues we're facing today and the challenges we're facing today. China, Russia, the future of NATO, the future of the multilateral system, so on. And I think Europe has to decide where it wants to go. Of course, we all know that the relationship with the US has always been a rather divisive issue for the Europeans, and it remains so. And if Europe wants to build back, it has to have a straightforward discussion among its 27 member states about where exactly it wants to go and what kind of strategic vision it wants to have on this renewed, updated, revisited transatlantic relationship that is there for us to see in the near future.
Thank you, Pierre. You're quite right. Even though the EU has actually come up with some proposals of areas to work in which it can work with the US, the sort of bigger vision is still missing, and member states are still divided, public opinions are still divided. So speaking of what can be done by the US and the EU together, and based on the premise that there has been a significant loss of trust over the past 4 years, on the backdrop of relations that were often tense, and there are divergences between the US and the EU. There also are convergences, of course, but on the basis of this. Our assumption when writing the compendium was that because it was important to build trust between the two sides, it was also important to identify some areas where the two could actually achieve something early on in the first 6 months of 2021. So I'd like to ask you, what do you think could be done relatively easily? I mean, we've seen, executive orders coming out of the White House are really changing the cards on the table. What can be done, Cathryn, I'd like to start with you, that can help, that can just not just solve the particular issue at hand, but also help rebuild this trust?
So I'll take a step back, because I think what you've both described is exactly both sides need to realize, and I think the Americans have already come to this conclusion, and I think some European countries have seen this as well, is that what we are in is historic systemic competition. It's about authoritarianism versus the functionality and the capacity for democracies to deliver the very fundamental promises that are embedded in their logic, which is freedom, and safety, justice for all, but combined with functional capitalism that supports societies, from the ground up. And if we're not able to deliver on the premise and promise of democracy, as Pierre rightly alluded, then what are we in terms of, an example to the world? And this is particularly true if we think about other parts of the world who have so long emulated what we have done. And so, first and foremost, coming to this joint conclusion that what we're really dealing with now is something much larger even than our composite parts, and on the urgency of that, embracing both the sort of what might be seen as sort of short-term tactical things, but then the long-term strategic objectives. And that begins with something that might sound terribly naive, but again, we saw how much can happen both internal in a democracy like the United States over 4 years when political norms and general functionality bleeds out of a system of rules and laws where just the rules and laws hold it together. We've realized that that's simply not enough. And what belongs to the norms in the transatlantic relationship is that we have open and forthright discussion. We meet often. We don't neglect this relationship. So even though we have traditionally perhaps made light of summitry, but the fact that, things like an EU-U.S. summit in a functional way hasn't really worked very well. Since George W. Bush, it's been neglected because we've assumed these basic premises undergird our relationship. We now see that is, or have seen that is no longer the case. In fact, most of us Europeans, speaking from my European half, try to decode, what was wrong with the rest of America for the last 4 years. That seems to show that we don't understand each other anymore, at least not fully. And so, yes, there are the important, components of actually getting to sit down with one another, which otherwise in other previous administrations, we would have just taken as normal course. But I do think it's important to make this point. And then there are very obvious, quick things. We need to lay down the weapons of war that the unilateralist American perspective infringed on the international community. It's schizophrenic, right? On the one hand, the United States stepped away from all of its international leadership roles, leaving a vacuum for the rise of authoritarianism in the multilateral architecture. And I think particularly of norms and standard setting capacities that China and Russia have pushed in the UN system while we were all looking away or too concerned about what was going on at home. So that's it. But so that means freezing sanctions. Nord Stream, I'm part German, so that's, of course, a big piece, right? So on all the economic and trade pieces, the steel and aluminum sanctions and tariffs, the sanctions on Nord Stream, we have to get to a freeze where we're back at the negotiation table. We're looking at the issues involved and at the wider geostrategic and geoeconomic issues affected in all of these components, so that we're coming again to what is a wider objective here. There are relatively quick things in NATO. If we're serious about pushing back against Russian overreach, and we've seen, take only the last few weeks between the Navalny arrest, the SolarWinds attack, and obviously the incursions that keep going on in almost daily way in Europe's eastern neighborhood, then let's think about making enhanced forward presence, and the 4 operations in Poland and Latvia and Lithuania, et cetera. Let's make those permanent. Let's reinvest in that. Let's not make hasty decisions when it comes to weakening potentially achievements that we have made together. So when we look at Afghanistan, that's something we should, be coming out of together if that is the plan? And then what is the longer term plan there? So, but fundamentally, I mean, these are all things that have potentially a medium term arc, but we need to really show our citizens. Germany is heading into a critical election year. France faces a critical election year right after. That democracy, and to Pierre's very good point about Portugal, and today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. Democracy is worth the every fight. And in order to do that, we need to deliver for our citizens. And so as gnarly as the trade issues were around TTIP, quick things on reducing tariff and non-tariff barriers around industrial goods. I mean, we can really get into the weeds here. But what it needs to amount to is that European and American citizens feel the impact of democratic delivery in their personal safety, in their economic advancement, and in the advancement of the generation that comes behind. And if the majority of Americans now feel that their children will no longer be better off than they were, then that seems to be a pretty deep breakage in the promise of the United States, or the promise of the idea of America. And so I think, combining around the bigger systemic challenge to our democracies and their functionality, and building all the other policy areas below, technology, everything will wrap around how we engage with Russia and China and how we deliver for our systems at home.
Thank you, Cathryn. Of course, the domestic dimension and the need both for the US and Europe to speak to their publics and justify foreign policy choices. Again, I think there are few times in history, except for wartime, of course, where that need is so so important. Pierre, I'd like to ask you the same question. Quick fixes, how to build back trust. And just refer, because you're also author of one of the pieces in the compendium, and you're looking at the Middle East. And of course, one of the, in case you want to mention Iran, because that's one of the areas where the Biden administration pledged to return to the JCPOA. But of course, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So if you want to make any reference to your piece, please do so. If you don't, I'm just going to refer our audience and suggest that they go and read it. Pierre, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. And I, of course, very much agree with what Cathryn just said. Of course, it's always a bit difficult to make a distinction between the short-term issues, the quick fix, as you said, and the long game, because everything is interrelated. And of course, long game requires strategic vision, but at the same time, you have to start somewhere and to move along. So I think it's very much a matter of how do you take all these different building blocks and how you put them one after another. But just listening to what Cathryn was saying about trade, I very much agree with her. I think what we should avoid at all costs when we discuss trade with our American partners is to have too high expectations, to move back to the former TTIP discussion. This will go nowhere, in my opinion. And with the strong lessons learned we have from our previous trade negotiation, it's rather moving into bits and pieces, as you were rightly saying, steel tariff, other issues related to food security, whatever. I would add one: Airbus versus Boeing.
Absolutely. Agreed.
It has been going on for all too long. And if at last, with the new Biden administration, we were able to find a solution to this ever dragging issue that we have been going on discussing for so long with tits for tats, etc., that would be very useful. But trying to find one or two other issues, I would maybe move to our neighborhood. And I agree very much with, here again, what Cathryn was saying, but rather than going to the eastern neighborhood, I will go down south. I think, first of all, Libya is a place where the EU and the US should try to put all their efforts and their support to what the UN is trying to do at the moment. We have a ceasefire now. We have a political discussion going on between all the different parties inside Libya. So there's a road there that we need to support, enhance, and push forward as much as we can. And of course, some of the sponsors that are around the different parties are trying by a way or another to undermine this ongoing effort. And I think for the EU, just as for the US, there needs to be more buying into the UN process and a strong support to the UN. Because we see Russia on one side, Turkey on the other side, trying by a way or another to regain the upper hand on this confrontation, on this crisis. And I think we should try to avoid that at all costs. So for me, Libya is definitely a place where the new US administration should take a bigger part. And I know that this may not be among their priorities, but let's be aware that if nothing is done very quickly to support the UN Special Envoy, who is the new one, who is going to work on this one, we may be facing new challenges there. And then the second one, of course, relates a little bit to what I wrote, but I think independently for what I wrote, it is an important issue. It's about Iran and the Iranian nuclear deal. Because for me, this is a key. As it will move on and unfold, if we manage to put the JCPOA back on the right track, it will unfold a whole new prospect for maybe a more secure and stable Middle East, be it the Gulf region, be it also maybe if we have to go back at some stage to the Middle East peace process between Israel and the Palestinian. Bringing back Iran into this security game, and this is the only way to do it is through JCPOA, seems to be the right way to proceed. And furthermore, there is a sense of urgency, of course, because the delay, what we call the breakout, which is the moment when the delay before the Iranian side has the military nuclear capacity is shortening. One of the main results of the maximum pressure from the Trump administration is that it has shortened and reduced this delay from more than a year to now something between 3 or 4 months. So time is of the essence there. The clock is ticking, and we have to move very quickly. I don't believe we can put everything on the table at this stage. I think it's all about sequencing and how to move quickly. It should be, and it's not easy, let's be honest. It will be about how the American on one side, the Iranians on the other side can recomply with the provisions of the JCPOA on both sides. And let's be honest, this is going to be difficult because since 2018, when the previous US administration decided to withdraw from the Iranian deal, a lot has changed. The state of mind of many of the actors have moved along, and the situation on the ground is quite different, certainly on the Iranian side. But China and Russia haven't stood put and waited for something to happen. They have moved along, and they may see with a different eyes from a few years ago the United States moving back into the Middle East and into that region. So one has to be very careful there. But if we manage to do that, and that once again is a major priority for the next 3 or 4 months, then if we manage to have both America and Iran coming back and complying again with their commitments inside this JCPOA, then we can move further on the road and try to build up a diplomatic initiative around the security of the Gulf region. And if we have been able to reassure Israel also on this Iranian threat, then to move along into discussing again a possible peace solution with the Palestinian side. And that may have many other fallouts all around the regions that would be very useful. So I would certainly pick up Iran and the JCPOA as one of the major issues to look into right now.
Rosa, can I add just a 2-finger to this? And I know we need to move on and we want to get the audience in, but I think it's important. I also run a program on diplomacy, and Pierre is the consummate diplomat. And I think it's critical to point out here exactly what he said about sequencing. And apparently now my phone is ringing, but ignore that as much as you can. But I think it's critical to point out here the role that the Europeans have to play and what I think the Americans acknowledge, because they have kept the Iranian deal together. And though the American appetite has also now grown larger, which is to say that, some people in this new administration are floating the missiles question as part of an enlarged Iran piece. And I think that is ultimately politically true. But the sequencing here will be where the Europeans can really offer stewardship and knowledge, because, and this is why I keep saying, for every critical question, China, technology, Middle East, we have to meet each other at eye level, because what has become clear in this sort of systemic shift that we have experienced over the past 4 years, because as Pierre says, the Chinese and the Russians have not been asleep at the wheel, is that it's really clear that we are so interdependent, and we can only do this together. And that means pulling on the different knowledge levels and capacities here. And I think having Wendy Sherman, Jake Sullivan, people who were the architects of the original JCPOA back is important. But the knowledge right now, if you will, is much more, the detailed knowledge is much more on the European side. And so getting back to open listening, creative solutions, constantly checking in with one another on various different issues is what's going to make, this difficult diplomatic ballet possible. And so I am, as gnarly and difficult as the situation on the ground is, as Pierre has said, I'm ultimately hopeful that with this care and focus and an American ability to listen to the Europeans who will say, now is the time or not the time to bring in components around the missile question, is critical. And I think with this personnel, we're there, and we will make strides, and we will make them quickly, because the situation is quite dire.
Thank you, Cathryn. And I'd like to continue this and just ask you, what are going to be the big headaches in the US-EU relationship? We've mentioned some of the critical elements. There will be more. We know that some of Biden's advisors were not pleased at the EU signing a comprehensive agreement on investments with China at the very end of last year. So I'd like to ask you both about, what are going to be the big hurdles premising it with my belief that even if the EU and the US don't perfectly align, it's really important to talk about it and be transparent about one's positions. But before I pass you the floor, I just want to prepare our audience, because they can begin thinking up their questions. We will have 10 minutes for questions if our speakers are brief on this last question. So if you want to do so, you can send in a question via Twitter, via email, on the YouTube chat. So you'll be able to, interact directly with the speakers. So please, Cathryn, let's move on to this final issue. What are
I'll try to be very quick. I mean, the impulse has to be that we think longer term. And again, we see the challenges for what they are, systemic and cataclysmic. The muscle memory is to revolve back to some sort of protectionist action. And I think how we interpret the protectionist impulse of the other side, if we're not talking in the way that we need to, I think can be very dangerous. So, the American side was concerned about the design of the CAI. That's going to take a year to implement. There's ways to shape that together so that, what the Europeans had built into the CAI specifically on labor standards, on human rights practice, actually has feet and clout. There's ability to move there. Unfortunate in timing, I agree, but we can do things there. But, on the protectionist, the Buy American piece, well, that ruffled a lot of European feathers. But we have those same impulses. When Joseph Borrell says, how can it be that, we can't produce a single tablet of paracetamol in Europe? We need to start aligning our value chains and see where in transatlantic value chains we have gaps that can be easily manipulated by other countries, China, Russia, and elsewhere. I think that's a proactive and creative and straightforward way of getting around protectionist impulses, particularly in the trade piece. Technology, I'm sorry. No matter if we talk about digital sovereignty all day long, the fact of the matter is we Europeans, again, wearing my European, not American hat, we're not fast enough. But conversely, the Europeans have the technology and the hardware issue in 5G that, taken together with American 5G software solutions and American emphasis on buying Nokia and Ericsson, could actually make sure that we come to not only a technologically functional, but also secure solution to the 5G dilemma. I want to be creative and positive here. I think there's much to do there. But, on things like Gaia X, Microsoft just joined. Turns out, I don't think we can do it without the Americans, quote unquote, or the Americans can't do it without us. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to do things together in the areas where they seem gnarly and impossible to resolve. This Biden administration is committed to coming back to the negotiation table at the OECD around digital tax issues. I do think that for that to happen in good faith, because that's clearly a problem area, the European individual member states have to roll back or change the timeline for which they want to launch their own digital tax pushes. So, again, this is about laying down some of the weapons of war, fully understanding, and this gets back to the practice of diplomacy, with empathy and an eye on domestic constraints, because very clearly President Biden had to make these decisions around Buy America for a domestic audience. The better we can understand the constraints that each side faces at home, the more open and effective we can be at, tackling the issues that divide us, whether it's on trade, whether it's on technology, whether it's on how we address China. But the floor has to be getting back to that level of understanding of what drives politics at home and what the 30,000-foot systemic needs are.
Mutual empathy. Pierre, I'd like to ask you the same question, but I'm also going to pick one of the questions that have come in from the chat, which is about China. Maybe you'd like to say a few words on that as well as your free question as to what the major headaches will be.
Yes, I could try, because I very much, once again, agree with what Cathryn has said, and I think this is going to be a major issue in the long game, how to bring together Europeans and the US on a common vision about all these different challenges. But there is one concern, it seems to me, that to some extent goes further than all of this, which is the way Europeans on one side, Americans on the other side, look at the multilateral order and the future of the multilateral order. The fact that we have a US administration eager to come back into the multilateral order, as we have seen with the most recent executive decisions that have been taken, WHO, the Paris Agreement on climate change, so on and so forth. All this is all very well. But the problem Western countries, US and Europeans together, are facing today is that multilateral order is being more and more contested by the non-West nations as a system that was mostly done for the benefit and the interest of the Western countries, and something has to change. It's not only about the current institutions and the very poor or under par representation of many of these countries in the UN Security Council, for instance. It's also about how do you reform WHO and what do you want to do there? How do you reform WTO and the kind of new rules you try to set up? And there we are definitely discussing the China issue, how to have a real, thorough, solid level playing field in the trade sector as we move along. What kind of new rules must we try to implement? How can we work together in order to be as effective and efficient as possible? But I can go one step further on the whole issue of the rule of law, which is certainly one of the multilateral challenges that we're facing today, the rule of law being contested day after day by the new power politics that we're facing in the international world. How can we work together in order to improve our standing, the Western standing in the multilateral order, while at the same time taking into account the grievances from some of our partners, from Africa, from Asia and elsewhere? I think that's really important, and I'm not entirely sure that we have exactly the same view. I'm not even sure that Europeans among themselves have exactly the same view. Europe is all about the multilateral order, because Europe is definitely the best friend of multilateralism. But even Europe hasn't made up really its mind about what it wanted to do. And when you come to the details of how to improve the multilateral order today, the international order, be it on the economic dimension, social dimension, education, development assistance, rule of law, peace, security, whatever, we may not exactly have the same approach. And I think this is where we really need to discuss together more and more about how together, because we need to be together on board, how together we can push forward a new vision about what the future multilateral orders should be.
Mm-hmm. And if I can just add, I think, Pierre, I think that is absolutely right. And that to me is part of the systemic, well, we could call it competition, but at least the big systemic questions here. And I think the one to take that one step further is if we're able to agree on the fundamental tenets that hold this multilateral institutional mechanism, but also political functionality together, then how do we ensure compliance? Because what we have certainly seen over the last 4 years is the development of nothing but parallel structures headed up by the Chinese that supposedly, and I'm being American and flippant, look and smell and taste like multilateralism, but are very clearly orchestrated in Beijing. Think of all the trade components, think of how BRI has built out, think of the odd partnerships that have been struck between China and Russia on a number of issues that really begin to skirt or pervert the basic premise of the multilateral architecture. And I'll repeat the point that I made earlier, the way that in the absence of American leadership and American focus and dedication, Russia and China have perverted certain bodies within the United Nations to make them sort of retrofit for their purpose. I think Pierre is absolutely right, is exceptionally dangerous. And again, undermines the credibility and capacities of what democracies need to do to keep the system together. And so I think here too, there's that domestic component of how that feeds down and connects to what we stand for. And then there's the actual, 30,000 foot practical piece of how we preserve contingent problem solving in this world, given the many challenges that we face.
Could I just add one point about China, Rosa, which is exactly the point made by Cathryn. I was quite struck by the amount of criticism that came over the comprehensive agreement on investment between China and the EU. A lot of criticism about timing, and I understand that, but at the same time, it's never the right moment with China when you want to make a deal, because be it Taiwan, Hong Kong, or the Uyghurs, there's also always a problem there. It's not about the substance, I think, because there is real openings on the Chinese side when you read this agreement at the moment. It's about compliance, I think, and it's the general idea that is it worth having an agreement with China when you immediately think that it will never be respected by the other side to some extent. And I think this is where we need precisely to discuss with our American friends to decide how we will improve compliance with the kind of agreements we will reach with China. And by the way, this is not only about economy, it's also about security and defense. When you see on a matter like Libya, this conference in Berlin at the beginning of last year, where everybody agreed to go along the decisions that were taken at Berlin. No more weapons supply to the different parties in Libya. No more support to one side against the other, but all playing together to try to bring peace and security in Libya. And as soon as the Berlin conference ended, everybody went back to its usual political game. So it's a sort of a world where it's a free-for-all, and it doesn't work that way. If you want to have some kind of stability and multilateral order, and that's the problem today.
Thank you, Pierre. We've pretty much come to the end, so I won't be able to ask more questions, but maybe I can ask you a sort of 20-second elevator pitch. How would you persuade skeptics about the transatlantic relationship respectively in America and in Europe? How would you persuade them that it's worth investing on this relationship? Cathryn.
Democracy, and by extension, the transatlantic relationship, is what keeps us safe, prosperous, functional, free, and creative. Not only in our individual societies, but in the world at large. It's the only relationship that can serve as the clarion call, as the basis, the nucleus for addressing all the challenges that we face globally, from climate change to energy issues to migration, food security, and water security, that can continue to deliver for the international community. Is paramount. It is tantamount that we keep this relationship together, and not only together, but flourishing, so that through a combination of its soft power, the fact that it works and delivers, and its message, its hopeful, optimistic message, and through its delivery, it can supersede the easy solutions that seem to be presented by the authoritarian powers in this world. For that, we need the commitment of both of our nations on both sides, and we need the commitment of our peoples, and making those arguments toward our peoples on why that is critical, I think, is the challenge of 21st century democracy on both sides. And I think to that, at Carnegie, at the Harvard Kennedy School, we're all committed. So we got to roll up our sleeves and get it done.
And Pierre, how would you sell it to, transatlantic skeptics in Europe?
I would stick to democracy also. And at the end of the day, in spite of everything that has been said about the Capitol attack and the risk of insurrection, American democracy stood up and resisted. And I think it is a very useful lesson for all of us. The way the checks and balances everywhere managed to go along, the way in each of U.S. administration, Homeland Security, Justice, in the states like Georgia and everywhere, single individuals, officials stood up and resisted and managed to get it through and managed the whole democratic process to move along. I think it's really a lesson we have to learn as we see. I don't know how to call it, illiberalism creeping in some of the European member states. I think it's a lesson worth taking into account and thinking about it. It's a marvel in me, a very enlightening illustration of how democracy works, how democracy can be under threat, and how at the end of the day it can move along. And I think this is something where our partnership with our American friends is so useful.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Thank you, Cathryn. You've been amazing at painting the big picture, the systemic issues, but also going into very concrete policy details. I really appreciate this combination. I'd also like to thank the audience for being with us. And please let me also thank my colleagues, Alice Vervaeke and the comms team, for making this happen. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the US mission to the EU, with whom we have a partnership. And we're working on transatlantic issues, and we'll be continuing to work with them throughout the year so that we can organize more events of this sort and continue this conversation during 2021. So thank you very much for being with us, and we'll see you next time.